before we start, I just want to obviously acknowledge our ancestors that are in the space, and to acknowledge the pain of their past and the continuous pain of the people today, and ask them to guide us in all our proceedings today. So I'm obviously not the first person that has started with work like this, so I'm obviously on the shoulders of many activists that have come before me. So I'd like to acknowledge people like Professor Jati Bredekamp, Dr. Yvette Kloete, Professor Siraj Rasool, Juan Petrus Falboy, and many community activists who advocate for this work every day to move towards a better future for this generation and for those to come. And especially because they do it in a non-academic, non-museum space. Even though I work in the museum, I do need to acknowledge that. So I want this talk to be very positive because, like Lucretia said, you know, I do want to, it's important for the museum to learn what people, how people feel about it and what they would like us to do as the museum. So just to give you a bit of background how it works at Iziko, so we are a state institution, you know, and obviously the way that remains were collected in the past is atrocious. It was horrible. People were dug up, we have to be honest about that, and they were brought into the museum as, you know, they literally become an object of the state, you know, so we have them classified as ethical and unethical, but I just believe that all of them are unethical. You know, nothing should stay there because they were never supposed to be there. So my talk tonight is my personal experience and my journey with the remains. And basically it's my lived experience with them. You know, my family's here tonight and they know I work at the museum, but they don't know exactly what I do, so get us know and for us to worry for now. Okay. So I started at Iziko in 2012 as the PA to the CEO. Yes, I was making tea and answering phones. And my first experience with remains was when we had a conference in 2016, and that was with academic institutions, museums, and different communities. There I met Uma Katrina Iso for the first time. She probably doesn't even remember me, but you know, she doesn't know that at the time she actually brought me to where I am today and the work I'm doing today. So at the end of the 3-day conference, she asked to say a prayer where the remains are. Through the conference, I was chatting to her and making tea, as was my job. When she made that request to pray with the remains, however, she asked me, of all people, to accompany her. I didn't know why, and I must say I felt unworthy. But she asked, and I went. I wasn't scared, I must say, but I was not prepared either. Going into that room where the remains were hit me like I could not even have imagined. I had a physical reaction. No boxes were opened, but we prayed, and there was lots of tears. After this, my colleague asked me if I would assist her with the casts in the collection. She took me through the first time, and after that, I went alone. Once again, I wasn't scared. I was just really sad that they were there. I greeted them when I came into the room, and I apologized to them when I put off the light and had to leave, leaving them behind. So in 2018, I did an exhibition here at the castle, and I called it Interesting Times. It focused on the unethically collected remains of especially women and children housed in the Archaeology unit at Iziko, to draw on the similarities of women and children who are still silenced by the pain, violence, and suffering being experienced today. It was supposed to run only for the 16 days of activism against, for no violence against children and women, but the public actually wanted it to go on longer. So it was extended for another couple of months here at the castle. So what made me want to do the exhibition was, while I was working there every day, I experienced discomfort and was haunted by the boxes and their contents. The more time I spent with them, the more I wanted to know more about them, their lives, who they were, and their stories. However, the more I researched, the darker the story of these individuals, their lives, their death, and their fate became. The motivation behind this exhibition was not only to uncover the dark past of the museum and what happened to those individuals in life and in death, but also to expose the dark memories we have to deal with every day and to seek a solution in an attempt to address this regrettable past. I make this statement as the human remains continue to be housed in the dark rooms of museums and universities around the country and around the world. As a museum practitioner, I felt that I had an obligation to the public we serve to create a platform that will allow them to know what the museum sector has to deal with, and to know that museums are trying to right the wrongs of their inherited past. Because no matter how people feel about museums, we are all just people that have to work in these institutions. And immense is immense, and we just try and do the best we can as people. So doing an exhibition on any sensitive issue, especially sacred ancestral remains, is very difficult. You want to get your message across while at the same time being respectful to the visitors experiencing and dealing with human remains, to the affected communities who are fighting for the return of their ancestors, but especially for those remains who are still in our collections and who were not afforded the respect they deserved in life as well as in death. Museums have a mandate, so this is our mandate, to educate and inspire people to celebrate their heritage. But part of their heritage is only known to museums. We write papers for ourselves and others within the heritage, government, and academic sector. And when I did the exhibition, I was surprised to learn how little is known about human remains by our communities and the public, as well as the involvement of museums in the issue. I discovered this through doing research with the public and included them in my planning phases, because when we do exhibitions, we have this idea in mind of what we want people to see. But speaking to the public before the time on a Heritage Day, I just went out and I randomly spoke to people. People didn't even know who Sarah Baartman was. And that alone for me was a shock. I was just feeling, are we failing as a museum or as, what is being taught in schools? So the exhibition itself was situated here in Secunda House around the corner. And to enter into the space, you have to walk down 2 steps, and it's quite dark, and the door is then closed behind you. The exhibition consisted of 2 rooms. The first room exhibited empty human remains boxes, grave goods, as well as a replica of the Human Remains Acquisitions Register. So just to explain, when they come in, they go into a register. That register gives them a number, and that number takes away their name. It takes away their identity. And I wanted to show people exactly what the box looked like. There were no remains in it, but people need to know this is what we have to deal with, not only as museum practitioners, but as the remains that are still housed there. So the exhibition itself was dark with only strategic lights on specific objects. Even though the room was closed off from the outside world, one could still hear the children screaming outside, the visitors talking and asking questions. You could hear life. But being in that dark room gave one the sense of being buried alive. Sorry. Being alone in darkened silence, like they are every day. Upon entering the space, visitors were presented with a lamp. The idea was that the viewer will feel that they are part of the journey of bringing the dark secrets of the museum world to light. The light being both a metaphor and a physical light, to allow the awakening they are experiencing in that moment to be an act of their own doing. In the second room of the exhibition was the crate that housed the coffin which contained the remains of Sarah Baartman during her repatriation to South Africa in 2002. The significance of the crate was its emptiness, a successful repatriation after a long struggle for her remains to come from Paris. In life, she was probed, prodded, racially studied and displayed like an animal and an object. In death, she was dissected and studied further, while parts of her anatomy were put on display. In my attempt to restore the dignity of Sarah Baartman, I translated the poem of Diana Ferris, I Have Come to Take You Home, into Afrikaans, as well as into Nama. Translating the poem into this language, possibly her language, we don't know, was to give her her own voice in this space. The words spoken in her own possible language, the pain and degradation she had to endure in life, I wanted her to have her voice back. And this is the poem here of Diana Ferris. And I don't know if many of you know, but this poem was actually used to change French legislation in order to bring Sarah Baartman back. So one of the most powerful comments about the exhibition was from a guest who attended the opening event, Mrs. Joy Varis. And I quote, Going into that space and being exposed to what the first people here, when the colonists came, their God complex of thinking they are better and their inhumaneness of treating people as objects, that act of brutality, that act of inhumaneness of treating another human being. We as a people do not know much about our history. The exhibition was an exposure of what happened to the first people here in South Africa. It was evidence of what was done. The little lamp was so potent in its power that it brought to the space. When I walked in there, I could hear the cries. I could hear the many questions of the first people, and to know that we are descendants of them, and their cries have been silent the whole time, just to be heard by certain people who are privileged to be in that environment, and the ignorance of us as people. All the objects I chose was to create a visual voice of the human remains and to provide the visitor with a voice for their protection of their own thoughts, ideas, and criticism onto the object. The central focus, however, of the exhibition was to give a voice to those whose voices were taken away from them. Not only were they robbed of their voices, but their language, their identity, their culture, and their humanity. They were treated like animals and as objects. Every morning going into that dark room where the remains are housed, the significant moment of me turning on the light, seeing them, acknowledging them, hearing their cries and promising to not have them remain in darkened silence. Since then, however, since the exhibition, I started my master's in archaeology. And why I did it in this field was because I wanted to try and understand why these scientists think that it is okay to research and dissect these sacred ancestral remains up until today. During my field work, I went through my first experience of resistance to the science. I had a participant tell me, "Did you people not study us enough?" I was there representing a colonial institution, studying an extractive science. My history, my heritage, and my identity didn't matter at that moment. I was the colonizer. I was the one that was doing extractive science. I took the pak, soos mense sal sê. I did not justify and I didn't argue. I listened and I took to heart the pain and anger and vowed to do the right thing by him. And I just recently finished my degree. So yeah, that's over. But so obviously making sense of the field, because when people ask you what you study, you say archaeology. There's already like to come do more science about us. But I like this quote by Martin Engelbrecht. He says, "Steps must be taken to reconcile the past with the present, and archaeology can play a role in this. The items that can reconnect the so-called coloureds to their heritage are archaeological artifacts. The archaeological findings of early domestic tools in the Northern Cape and elsewhere give the impression of a far-off remote period and an extinct people, but such implements were used relatively recently by our grandparents. However, today, these stone tools are foreign to their Khoe and San heirs, like the mortal remains of Cornelius Koch II and his other royal kingsmen, which were exhumed during the 1960s and are now in a university collection. They have since though been buried. We view every new archaeological finding in South Africa as a step closer to our Khoe and San past, which will eventually reveal our future. Archaeologists must understand that within South Africa, everything they excavate will bring us closer to our past, a past which was until now been denied to us as we have been forcefully divorced from our heritage. Khoe and San peoples must be empowered to appreciate archaeology and be the fellow custodians of this proud heritage." So since then, I've also traveled quite a lot. 2 years ago, I went to Scotland because doing research on remains and having them repatriated, it's not just Iziko that has to bury out, there's also remains that have to come back from overseas. And I must say it was a very hectic experience going into that room, because this couple, their remains were collected and sent over in the 1800s. And for me to be the first person from Africa to be in their presence after that long, I just told all those white people to leave. I'm sorry for saying that, but I told them to leave. I told them it was not your space. You were never supposed to have them. And I just stayed there and I cried. I cried because they were never supposed to be there. And I cried because I was privileged enough to be in that space. And I actually brought the curator back from Scotland, and I took him into the Kalahari, and I said, go see the faces of the people that you have in your collections. And I told him, I'm taking you in here on condition that you do not break the trust that I built up with these communities. Because being from Iziko and an archaeology graduate now, you already get looked at. So I have to work really hard to build that trust. And ek sê vir hom, jy breek nie nou daai vertroue nie. You don't break that trust. And out of his own, he apologized. He said, I'm apologizing for my people and what they have done. And I promise. And I told him, you don't make promises, but he made it. And now, unfortunately, it's been 2 years and it's now stuck at government level. You know, because this is what happens. Museums can talk to each other, but at the government level, that government must now talk to our government to bring them back. So I must just say, it's not an easy job, but it needs to be done. One of my last experiences with the sacred ancestral remains was when community members asked to say a prayer with remains from their area. I had to take the box out from the shelf, unwrap the remains, and we prayed. I could not bring myself to put them back. My body physically did not want me to do it. I felt ashamed to have to put them back and not send them home. But we are busy as the institution. Our ancestors are no longer talking, they are screaming. Of soos Petrus Valboy sê altyd, die bene praat nie meer, hulle raas nou. So today, I went to them again, just to pray and to cry and to ask for guidance. Guidance for knowledge, insight, and wisdom. I cried because I felt like I failed them. I feel like I fail them every time I leave. But I know that they will go home because they must. So in working with the sacred ancestral remains, as well as with affected communities, I feel that their repatriation will come with a restoration. A restoration not only for them, but for the descendants. Restoration of a voice of dignity and of respect. The voices of those who remains are in boxes and institutions may be silenced, but their cries and echoes are felt through the generations. They were our people. They were mothers, fathers, grandmothers, babies, brothers and sisters. They were our people, and it is our duty to remember them, who they were, and for their stories to be told. Remembering them gives them a voice and healing to the living and to the dead. The museum community is an old society, and the current institution is often judged by the sins of the past. Museums are blamed for the wrongs of its forebearers, and as the museum, we have the responsibility to admit to those wrongs. As an indigenous curator, researcher, and heritage practitioner, I believe that we have to expose the badness of our past in order to leave a legacy not of fighting amongst and with each other, but of trying to work together to reach a common goal, to return that which was forcefully and wrongfully removed back to where they were taken from. Because what we do today is a legacy of the heritage we leave for the next generation. We have to hear the voice of our people. We have to heed their call and put policies and procedures into practice. We need to make work of our words. In our lifetime, we have a responsibility to leave a legacy of restoration. Thank you. Come.